A little over 2 weeks ago, on June 5th, the world of biblical studies lost a great scholar, Walter Brueggemann. With over 100 books published and dozens of scholarly articles, it is difficult to express the impact he made on generations of scholars, pastors, and preachers. I got to meet him once in 2001 when he was here in Fresno as the lecturer at the Interfaith Scholars Weekend. I always thought of him as kind of the Sean Connery of biblical studies. Can you see the resemblance? Thank you. I mean, I had to find just the right pictures, but it works. Of note in his long list of publications is The Prophetic Imagination, which I first read as a student myself at Fresno Pacific University, and then assigned to my own students when I was teaching. His death has sparked an outpouring of tributes, an online memorial of sorts, as people write about the ways in which Brueggemann's work has influenced their own. Speaking decades after the publication of The Prophetic Imagination, Brueggemann says, "If you take the phrase, prophetic imagination, the imagination part of that is that the prophets are able to imagine a world other than the way that it is in front of them. That is why being a prophet is dangerous work. The powers that be want status quo and numbness. They don't want the world different than the way that it is." The prophet Elijah knows this all too well. He seems to appear out of nowhere in 1 Kings 17, 2 chapters earlier than our reading today. Elijah's entire ministry is set in the context of scarcity and famine. In chapters 17 and 18, we see God providing for Elijah outside of Israel through ravens, a seasonal stream, and a foreign widow. Sounds about right for a prophet. From the first, Elijah has been a troublemaker for the king. These days, we might call that good trouble. Actually, it's King Ahab and his wife Jezebel who are the troublemakers for Israel, with their building campaigns for Baal worship, among other things. In his commentary on Kings, Brueggemann writes that Baalism is a socio-religious system rooted in the capacity to secure life for self by the manipulation and control of the gifts of the Creator, by self-centered management that inevitably leads to an anti-neighbor ethic. Tensions have been building between Elijah and Ahab, leading to what is sometimes called the contest or showdown at Mount Carmel between Elijah as the lone prophet on the side of Yahweh versus 450 prophets of Baal. These two sides, according to Brueggemann, represent competing social systems and alternative accounts of the world. The contest or public demonstration against Baalism is highly dramatic and quite entertaining, full of zingers from Elijah as he taunts the prophets of Baal. When Baal doesn't respond to the cries of his prophets and the sacrificial bull on their side remains unconsumed, it's Elijah's turn. Elijah prays, and Yahweh rains down fire. As the text says, it consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. This victory is the pinnacle of Elijah's prophetic career. And as proof, Yahweh sends rain that ends the drought and the famine. In response to the clear defeat of Baal at Mount Carmel, Jezebel rains down her own threat on Elijah that puts him on the run. I can't say for sure what happened to Elijah on a psychological level, but we see in the text that he's now ready to throw in the towel. After such zealous and superhuman feats as we see in the story, perhaps he, understandably, assumed that the struggle would now be over. But the big prophetic demonstration, public demonstration, did not yield results that he hoped for. Ahab and Jezebel did not change their ways. Despite the rain, all Elijah sees is famine. He flees south to Beersheba, outside the jurisdiction of Ahab and Jezebel, to the Judean wilderness. The wilderness is a place where it seems God always provides for those who are faithful, almost like the manna and quail from Israel's past that God provided after being set free from Pharaoh. I wonder if God's provision for Elijah here sparks some kind of remembering in him and a desire to reconnect with Israel's prophetic roots, with the days of freedom from empire and a reliance on a God who was wild and could not be tethered to a temple or a king. He's given enough sustenance for the journey to Mount Horeb, known elsewhere as Mount Sinai, where the great hero Moses also experienced the awe-inspiring presence of God. Alongside Walter Brueggemann, I've been reading another prolific author, Wendell Berry. Walter and Wendell were born only a year apart, and the year after Walter Brueggemann published The Prophetic Imagination, Wendell Berry published the essay, The Reactor and the Garden. And if that wasn't cute enough, they both have the same initials, WB. As I read this essay recently, I thought of Elijah on the run. Here, Berry recounts his participation in a protest against the building of a nuclear power plant. He says that even though he participated wholeheartedly in the protest, he is far from believing that such public acts are equal to their purpose, or that they ever will be. They are necessary, he admits, but they're not enough. Quote, public protests are incomplete actions. They speak to the problem, but not to the solution. They are, by definition, negative. You cannot protest for anything, end quote. He continues by asserting that their positive contribution is actually raising awareness, shaking off what Brueggemann might call the numbness of the royal consciousness. Royal consciousness, or ideological totalism, intends to contain all thinkable, imaginable, doable social possibilities. That totalism always wants to monopolize imagination, and it wants to monopolize technology, so that there are no serious alternatives that seem on offer. The royal consciousness, or ideological totalism, threatens to sap us of our moral and theological imaginations, plunging us into a numbness that always settles for the status quo because there are no other imaginable options. The wake-up, it would seem, is most effective with the protesters themselves. Take, for example, some of the signs we've seen recently in our own times. One says, you know it's bad when the introverts show up. That would be me. Or, you know it's bad when a straight white guy makes a sign. Berry and Brueggemann both make the point that part of the prophetic witness includes recognizing where we too are complicit in the very systems that we protest. In Berry's case, he points to the irony of protesting the building of a nuclear power plant arriving in cars that run on fossil fuel. This suggests to me that a protest might actually function like a parable, the way parables get under our skin and keep gnawing away at our unconsciousness. Thus, protests that turn the corner and become prophetic witnesses work when they work on us. When we begin to imagine and advocate for another way, and when we realize that there is no us and them, only us all together, then we're on to something. After Elijah has slept and been fed, he makes his way to Mount Horeb. The journey takes 40 days. When he arrives, he finds a cave to sleep in for the night. And then the text says that the word of the Lord came to him, asking why he was there. It seems Elijah is still feeling the sting of failure. That is, if he had expected the public demonstration at Mount Carmel to change the socio-political reality at the heart of Baalism. Or maybe it's pure fear at the wrath of Jezebel. Whatever it is, Elijah is feeling the squeeze of famine, drought, and scarcity, the same feeling that has dominated his ministry. He responds that he's been zealous in everything he's been called to do, and now he's left alone, and they're coming for him. God's response is simply, come out. This time, it's not just the word of the Lord, but the actual presence of the Lord that passes by. It's worth rereading verses 11 and 12. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. God repeats the question, why are you here? And Elijah repeats his response. He's done everything that he was called to do, and now he's all alone, and they're coming to get him. God responds by giving Elijah his next mission. The text doesn't tell us anything about Elijah's psychological state or what's changed for him, but he's no longer on the run, and I think that's saying something. Perhaps experiencing the presence of God was enough for him, enough to reclaim his prophetic imagination, the hope that things can and should be different. Well, what about us? In the Presbyterian Outlook, Andy Greenhow writes, amid the totalizing scarcity of late-stage capitalism and the ever-expanding assault on liberal democracy, it is tempting to grasp desperately at the wind, at the fire, at the earthquake, at anything. Our capacity to attend all the way through to the presence of God in the sheer silence feels vanishingly faint. And yet, that is precisely our call as disciples of the living God. Are our calls to action coming from our deep moral and theological commitments or from news headlines? What determines where we act? Are we just being whipped around by sound bites, tweets, and the many appalling actions of the administration? This reading from 1 Kings 19 can help us to remember that the work of justice isn't usually big and flashy. Earthquakes and fires and windstorms and all of that. And it doesn't happen overnight. The work of justice happens over a long period of time. And it probably isn't going to be covered by the news because, well, it just wouldn't sell. But I'm not saying don't protest, or that protests are bad, or anything like that. Wendell Berry reminds us that they're good and necessary, but they're incomplete. They can point out what's wrong, but they don't witness to an alternative reality for the flourishing of all. They can start the work, but they can't complete the work. May we attend all the way through to the presence of God in sheer silence. May we find our own prophetic voice that calls not just for a rearranging of who is in power, but for a new reality based in justice and compassion for all. May it be so. Amen.